German generals once mocked the 761st Tank Battalion, calling them a social experiment, not soldiers. They said black men could drive trucks, maybe haul fuel, but not command tanks, not against Hitler's finest, not in Europe's armored war. Yet these men, known as the Black Panthers, would go on to fight longer, harder, and farther than almost any armored unit in the U.S. Army. Their motto was a promise whispered in defiance: come out fighting. They trained under the southern sun of Jim Crow's America, where hate was as thick as the humidity. White officers doubted them, towns refused to serve them, and even their own army kept them separate. But inside their Shermans, those steel beasts that rattled and smoked through Louisiana mud, they found a purpose no one could deny. When they finally crossed the Atlantic in 1944, even General George S. Patton wasn't sure what to make of them. "I don't care what color you are," he said, "as long as you can kill the enemy." It was a cold benediction, and the Black Panthers answered with fire. From the fog of France to the frozen forests of Belgium, they fought 183 straight days without rest, smashing through the Siegfried Line, holding their ground at the Bulge, and rolling straight into Germany itself. They faced the enemy abroad and the prejudice of their own country at once. And when the war was done, they had liberated prisoners, captured 30,000 Germans, and carved their name into history, only to come home to silence. This is their story, the story of the tankers America forgot to thank, the men who turned mockery into fury, fury into courage, and courage into victory. They were the Black Panthers, and they never stopped fighting. The winter of 1942 settled over Louisiana like a shroud. The pine forests of Camp Claiborne were alive with the rumble of tank engines and the shouted cadence of new recruits, but one battalion trained apart from the rest, the 761st. They were all black, the first of their kind in the U.S. Army's Armored Corps. In an army still bound by segregation, it was an experiment few expected to succeed. White officers mocked the idea that black soldiers could master machines as complex as the Sherman tank. To most in Washington, the 761st was a curiosity, a political concession to pressure from civil rights advocates, not a combat unit meant for the front. When General George S. Patton inspected them that spring, he didn't mince words. "I don't care what color you are," he said, pacing before their formation, his ivory-handled pistol gleaming at his side. "As long as you can kill the enemy." It was not encouragement, it was challenge, blunt, cold, and without affection. The men took it as fuel. Their insignia, a Black Panther baring its teeth, was chosen deliberately. Their motto, "Come out fighting," wasn't just bravado, it was defiance made visible. For months they drilled under the southern sun until sweat carved tracks through the red dust on their faces. They learned to drive the M4 Sherman, a tank dependable but undergunned against the German Panther and Tiger. They memorized the rituals of combat: load, fire, traverse, reload. Every order came with a second weight, the need to prove not just competence, but worth. In the barracks, the air smelled of oil and gun grease. Men wrote letters home that began, "They don't think we'll make it." But their captain, a quiet man from Chicago named David Williams, told them otherwise. "Let them think what they want. When we roll, they'll remember." By late 1944, Europe was a continent of ruins. The Allies had landed in Normandy and broken out of the beaches, but victory was not yet certain. Germany still held much of France and the Low Countries, and the Ardennes forests hid the last fury of Hitler's war machine. When the 761st crossed the Atlantic that October, they were assigned to Patton's Third Army, the fastest, most aggressive force in Europe. Patton hadn't changed his mind about them. He didn't have to believe, he just needed tanks. The men disembarked under gray skies, their uniforms still smelling faintly of salt water and ship oil. Europe in autumn was nothing like Louisiana. The cold sank deep into their bones, and the mud swallowed the weight of every track. Yet, when the first orders came, "Move to the front," no one hesitated. They joined the 26th Infantry Division in northeastern France, near Morville-le-Vicq, where fog drifted low over the fields and artillery rolled like thunder beyond the hills. The Germans were dug in, veterans of years on the Eastern Front, their panzers hidden in hedgerows and villages turned into fortresses. The 761st's baptism would come not with ceremony, but with fire. Yastan, dawn on November 7th, 1944. The mist clung to the ground as the column rumbled forward. Inside one of the Shermans, Sergeant Reuben Rivers peered through the slit of his periscope. His crew, 5 men packed into steel, waited for his word. The radio crackled, then the first shot rang out. A German anti-tank gun had found its mark. The shell ripped through the earth ahead, showering dirt and metal fragments across the road. Rivers shouted orders. The engine roared. The Shermans surged forward. They hit back, 75mm shells pounding into enemy positions, the recoil slamming through their chests. Tank by tank, the Black Panthers advanced, through mud, smoke, and disbelief. By midday, they had taken the village. In Patton's headquarters, word reached the general that the 761st had broken the German line. He said nothing at first, only nodded, then quietly, "All right, let them keep fighting." For the men of the 761st, it was a beginning. The jokes stopped. The stares changed. And for the first time, the enemy, not their own countrymen, would measure their worth. They had come out fighting, and Europe was about to learn their name. The rain never stopped. From November through December 1944, northeastern France turned into a bog of ice and mud. For the men of the 761st Tank Battalion, it was their first winter at war, and it was merciless. They were attached to the 26th Infantry Division of Patton's Third Army, advancing through the Lorraine region toward the German border. The Germans fought with fanatic precision, striking from the fog, vanishing before counterfire. The Black Panthers learned fast, or died learning. Their Shermans, painted olive drab, were no match for the German Panthers or Tigers in a head-on duel. The German 88mm guns could slice through American armor at half a mile. The Sherman's own 75mm shells often bounced harmlessly off enemy hulls. So, the 761st adapted. They moved at night, they flanked, they hunted. Sergeant Reuben Rivers, commanding a company, became the kind of legend that only war forges. At Morville-le-Vic, his tank was hit by a mine. Metal tore into his leg, mangling it badly. The medics begged him to evacuate. Rivers refused. He bound his own wound and climbed back into the driver's seat. "We started this together," he told his crew. "We're finishing it together." 2 days later, his tank led the assault through the village of Goebling. German panzers were waiting. The ambush was precise. Smoke, shell, flame. Rivers' tank took another hit. This time, it didn't stop. He swung his turret and fired point blank, knocking out an enemy gun before his own tank was torn apart. He was killed instantly. His body wouldn't be found until the field was retaken days later. The men buried him in the frost, in silence. They didn't know that half a century later, in 1997, the nation that had once doubted them would award him the Medal of Honor. As the 761st pressed north, word of their ferocity began to circulate. Infantry units requested them by name. "Send the colored tanks," some officers said, sometimes with condescension, sometimes with awe. In towns like Vic-sur-Seille and Morville, they cracked the German lines that had resisted white battalions for weeks. They drove through shell fire, through ambushes, through disbelief. When Patton received their reports, he issued an order to the Third Army staff. "Do not waste the 761st. Use them." That winter, the order would take on new meaning. In December 1944, Hitler threw his last gamble. The Ardennes offensive, remembered as the Battle of the Bulge. The sky turned gray. The snow came down like ash. German armor poured through Belgium, smashing the Allied front wide open. Patton turned north with every tank he had. The 761st was among the first to move. They drove 100 miles in 24 hours, engines freezing, men sleepless. Inside the tanks, condensation froze on steel walls. Their breath turned to mist, but they kept moving. They reached Bastogne and pushed into villages like Tillet and Wardin, where American infantry were barely holding on. The Black Panthers went in first. One platoon fought off a counterattack by 20 German tanks, trading fire at ranges so close that the snow itself ignited from the heat. When the smoke cleared, 8 enemy tanks lay destroyed. The road to Bastogne remained open. For 183 consecutive days, the 761st fought without relief. They liberated towns across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany itself. The Wehrmacht, the same force that once laughed at the idea of black tankers, began referring to them in intercepted radio chatter. "Schwarze Panzer," one officer was heard saying. "They do not break." By the time the snow melted, the 761st had driven farther, fought longer, and lost more men than most white armored units in Europe. And still, they were not mentioned in dispatches. No newsreel footage, no headlines, just the next objective. But among those who fought beside them, the truth spread fast. A white infantry captain summed it up simply in his after-action report. "When you saw those Black Panthers rolling in behind you, you knew you'd make it out alive. In the mud and blood of the Bulge, the experiment became a legend. They had fought their way into history, not by permission, but by performance. And the German line, once thought unbreakable, was beginning to crack." By February 1945, the German army was dying, but not dead. The Siegfried Line, Hitler's last wall of bunkers, mines, and concrete teeth, stretched before the advancing Allies. Every mile was paid for in blood. The men of the 761st Tank Battalion had been fighting for 4 months without rest. Their tanks were scarred, their uniforms torn, their faces aged by frost and fatigue. And still, when Patton's orders came, advanced to the German border, they mounted up. The landscape of Western Germany was unlike anything they had seen. Rolling hills gutted by artillery, forests splintered into matchsticks, villages reduced to stone and shadow. The air smelled of cordite and smoke, of wet earth and fuel. Every field might hide a mine. Every farmhouse might conceal a Panzerfaust. Sergeant Warren Cressy, already known among his men as the baddest man in a Sherman, led the way outside Tillet. When his tank was hit and disabled, he climbed out under fire, seized a .50 caliber machine gun from the wreck, and stood in the open, firing until the German line broke. When his men begged him to take cover, he shouted, "You'll cover me when I'm dead." He wasn't. The Germans fell back. The 761st pushed forward. Their orders were relentless. Town after town, Tillet, Moissy, La Roche, Tilburg. They fought through resistance that refused to die. At night, when they stopped to refuel, the men slept inside the tanks to stay warm. Their rations froze solid, their boots never dried. Captain David Williams wrote home, "We keep moving and they keep shooting, but every mile we take, they can never take back." By March, the Black Panthers reached the Moselle River. Ahead lay the fortress city of Mannheim, its bridges mined, its approaches guarded by anti-tank guns and entrenched infantry. The 761st was ordered to lead the assault. The crossing began before dawn. Under a curtain of artillery fire, the tanks rolled forward, one by one, into the smoke. German fire raked the column. Shermans burned. Crews bailed out and climbed into other tanks. Overhead, P-47 Thunderbolts dove through the clouds, striking at gun emplacements along the riverbank. Through it all, the 761st kept advancing. They reached the opposite shore by midday, their treads grinding over the remains of the bridge. Behind them came the infantry. The crossing was secured. Patton's Third Army had broken through. In his field report, Patton wrote, "The 761st has performed with conspicuous bravery under fire. Their losses have been heavy, but their progress has been steady." He never mentioned color. He didn't need to. Everyone in the Third Army knew who they were. They rolled east through the Rhineland, liberating village after village, cutting through what remained of the Wehrmacht's armored reserves. German civilians lined the roads, staring in disbelief at the black tankers who thundered past. At the town of Steyr, the battalion captured over 1,000 enemy soldiers in a single day. One German officer, stunned to be taken prisoner by black Americans, muttered through a translator, "We were told your kind could not fight." A sergeant from Alabama replied quietly, "Now you know different." April 1945. The war was collapsing. The 761st pressed deep into Bavaria, smashing pockets of resistance as they went. In one shattered town near Gunskirchen, the battalion made a discovery that would silence even the most hardened men among them. The air stank of death. The fences were lined with wire and bone. They had stumbled upon one of the sub-camps of Mauthausen concentration camp. Inside were hundreds of emaciated prisoners, Jews, Poles, Russians, too weak to stand, too stunned to speak. The Black Panthers, who had spent their lives fighting for recognition from their own country, now found themselves freeing the forgotten of another nation. One tanker wrote later, "We came to fight Germans. "We didn't know we'd be fighting this." They gave the survivors their rations, their water, their coats. Some cried, some simply stared. The men of the 761st stayed there until medics and relief units arrived. Then, without ceremony, they climbed back into their tanks and kept moving. By war's end, the 761st had advanced across 6 countries and fought 183 consecutive days in combat, the longest continuous engagement of any American tank battalion in Europe. They had taken more than 30,000 prisoners, destroyed countless enemy vehicles, and earned over 400 medals for valor. And yet, as victory parades began in London and New York, there were no Black Panthers in the headlines, no photographs of them in Life magazine. The world was not yet ready to celebrate men who had proved its prejudice wrong, but among those who fought beside them, their legend had already taken root. They were no longer an experiment. They were a fact. May 1945. The guns went silent. In the forests of southern Germany, the tanks of the 761st finally stopped rolling. Their engines ticked as they cooled, the smell of oil and cordite lingering in the still air. The war in Europe was over. For the Black Panthers, victory felt both real and unreal. They had fought longer, harder, and farther than anyone had expected. But there were no photographers waiting, no generals giving speeches, no flags unfurled in their honor. They simply parked their tanks, climbed down, and sat in the grass. Exhausted men, eyes hollow, hands scarred black from steel and fire. Lieutenant John Long, one of the youngest officers in the battalion, wrote in his diary that night, "We won the war, but I don't know if we've won the right to be seen." Their record spoke for itself. 183 straight days in combat, 6 countries crossed, dozens of enemy tanks destroyed, more than 30,000 German prisoners captured. They had earned 11 Silver Stars, over 300 Bronze Stars, and a Medal of Honor, though that last would not come for another half-century. General Patton, the man who once doubted them, said quietly to his staff near war's end, "They're the best damn tankers I ever saw." He didn't write it in official orders, but everyone who'd seen them fight knew it was true. When the men of the 761st returned home, they stepped off the ships not as heroes, but as strangers. America, still segregated and divided, greeted them with the same suspicion they had left behind. No parades lined their streets, no flags hung in their honor. Many were denied housing or jobs because of the color of their skin, the same color that had stood out in the snow of Belgium, in the smoke of Lorraine, and against the gray skies of Germany. Sergeant Leon Boss, one of the tankers who had helped liberate Gunskirchen, remembered walking into a diner in Philadelphia wearing his uniform. The waitress refused to serve him. "I had liberated others," he said later, "but I was not yet free myself." Still, they stayed silent. The war had given them scars and pride in equal measure. They knew what they had done, even if no one else did. For decades, the story of the 761st Tank Battalion lived only in whispers, passed among veterans, told in basements, shared at reunions. They aged quietly, their uniforms fading in cedar chests, their medals tucked into drawers. It wasn't until the 1970s, when historians began digging through old field reports, that the truth re-emerged. The 761st had fought in nearly every major engagement of Patton's drive across Europe. They had held the line at Bastogne, cracked the Siegfried defenses, and liberated a concentration camp. The country finally began to listen. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter issued a unit citation recognizing their valor. In 1997, more than 50 years after he fell in France, Sergeant Reuben Rivers was awarded the Medal of Honor. His sister accepted it on his behalf. At the ceremony, one surviving Panther, his hair silver, his back straight, said softly to a reporter, "We never wanted pity, just memory." Today, the 761st Tank Battalion stands as a monument, not just to military excellence, but to endurance, the kind that outlasts doubt, silence, and time itself. Their Black Panther insignia still bears the same words, "Come out fighting." It is more than a motto now. It is a legacy. In the mud of Europe, they had proven that courage has no color, and though history took its time to remember, when it finally did, it found them where they had always been, in the front line of freedom, engines roaring, unbroken.